session. So we have, you know, slightly less than an hour, but we can be flexible on this. Thank you, Elizabeth, for recording. So just to let everybody know, we will be recording this session. So I think I've suggested to Jill that, you know, she can discuss her presentation for about 30 to 40 minutes. That will allow about 20 to 30 minutes, depending how we go, for a discussion at the end or a question and answer session. But as I say, we can be quite flexible within the next hour anyhow. The recording will then end. And then what will follow from the plenary would be the Interdisciplinary Perspectives Special Interest Group, or IPSIG, as we also call it, the IPSIG's annual general meeting, which we aim to start at 4:30. So all IPSIG members are very welcome to join that AGM. So without further ado, it's a pleasure to welcome Professor Jill Atkins to deliver the plenary for the IPSIG this year. Thank you again, Jill, for accepting the invitation for doing this. Now, Jill is based at Sheffield University Management School, I believe, although you're very much based in Wales at the moment.
Basically.
Yeah. And Jill's research focuses on responsible investment, social accounting, stakeholder accountability, and so forth. And she's recently co-edited a book on the business of bees, an integrated approach to bee decline and corporate responsibility, which explores the role of accounting in preserving biodiversity. And this brings me very nicely to Jill's presentation for today, which is on exploring the evolution of the extinction accounting field and identifying new pathways for research. So thank you again, Jill, and over to you.
Okay, thanks ever so much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me. It's an absolute pleasure to talk to the IPSIG plenary, really, really nice. So yes, I thought what I would do was, not rather than presenting one paper, talk about the area of extinction accounting, how I think it's now become a field in its own right, and also look at opening up pathways for further research, because there are lots of people working in this area now. So obviously, in terms of an interdisciplinary research field, I don't think that you can get much more interdisciplinary really than something which brings together accounting with species extinction and biodiversity. So as I've said here, you know, as interdisciplinary perspective accounting researchers, you're all acutely aware of the need to be interdisciplinary in research. And any area of accounting which cuts across other disciplines is so important, particularly at the moment. I think we're seeing in all disciplines a move towards interdisciplinarity, which is so crucial, whether it's in research or whether it's research funding applications, etc. And certainly I think it's important now that we move away from any sort of disciplinary silos in order to address global challenges such as climate change and of course biodiversity loss, which is the main thing here. So species extinction is not just an issue for conservationists and scientists, but also from my perspective, an issue for accountants, for the financial markets and for investors. What I'm going to do in the plenary is look at the evolution of extinction accounting and define the concept, look at motivations underlying extinction accounting, which are multiple, highlight some of the emerging literature, particularly some of the recent papers. One came out yesterday, so I've got that on a slide as well, and evaluate and assess how this field is expanding, as well as looking at potential areas for future research. As an interdisciplinary research area, it brings together ecology, botany, biology with accounting, finance and governance. So as I say, it couldn't really be more interdisciplinary in focus. In December 2020, I was contacted by one of the writers for Reuters, and they wanted to talk about the development of extinction accounting. So I think from my point of view, it means it gives it a focus as a mature concept and research area. So that was quite exciting. And that has had a lot of impact, I think, academically, but also in practice. So just a bit of background, any of you have already read some of the extinction accounting literature will recognise some of this, but basically at the moment we are in a period of mass extinction, the 6th period of mass extinction, where the 5th one was the disappearance of the dinosaurs. And if we look at some of the biology and the science, wildlife populations have fallen 58% between 1970 and 2012. I was born in 1969, so in my lifetimes, nearly 60% of wildlife populations have disappeared around the planet, which is a horrifying statistic. There was a very important report, IPBES, which was published in 2019, which basically estimates 25% of species threatened with extinction, which comes to a million. A million species are estimated to be threatened with extinction currently, and that is accelerating all the time. 75% of those are insects, and a lot of people would say, well, that's not particularly a problem because I don't like creepy crawly things, but actually it is a very important issue. So why is this happening? Well, obviously climate change is a factor, but it's by no means the only factor. It's a contributory factor, but one of the main issues really is habitat destruction and degradation, the disappearance of wild spaces. And of course, that's due mainly to businesses and companies and operations around the world. Pollution, disease, again, all arising from business activity, alien species, there's all sorts of examples of that around the world. And unfortunately, pesticides and herbicides. So one of the things that I've realized doing this research, which I hadn't really realized before, is that we spend all our time killing things. We kill insects all the time. We kill insects on crops in agriculture. And we also do in the domestic environment, gardeners, gardens, weed killers, etc. This is a massive problem for insect populations, particularly. So in terms of species extinction, how do we link it to accounting and finance? And it's really, first and foremost, a material financial issue. And this is something that I've been working on, the connections between material financial issues and extinction of species for quite a few years. And I think the easiest way of getting a handle on this is to look at the work that economists have done in estimating ecosystem services and the value of ecosystem services, such as pollination, for example. And they estimate, the most recent estimates, $145 trillion a year is the amount assigned to ecosystem services. Estimated 50,000 to 70,000 plant species used in medicines. So that's just looking at plants, not just animals, but flora and fauna. And about 100 million metric tons of aquatic organisms are taken for food, which contributes to the world society. So you can easily see that if these ecosystems are threatened and extinction continues at this rate, we're going to have problems servicing the human species. Insects, as I say, people don't particularly care about insects generally, but actually an insect apocalypse is absolutely terrible for the human race as well. And this is a quote from Wilson in 1992, an ecologist who said, so important to insects and other land-dwelling arthropods like spiders, for example, that if all were to disappear, humanity probably would not last more than a few months. Most of the amphibians, reptiles, birds and mammals would crash to extinction about the same time, which is a really horrifying apocalyptic type of comment, I think. As Sarah mentioned, we produced a book in 2016 on bee decline. So I've been looking at what companies were reporting on bees and bee decline, and they were starting to pay attention to bee decline, particularly in the food industry, for example. The latest figures suggest that up to about $577 billion in annual global crop output is actually at risk as a result of pollinator loss. So we can see a distinct financial materiality to the loss of pollinators and particularly bees. Basically, bees are declining at 40–50% in the commercial bee populations in the United States, for example. There are massive declines in bee populations, both wild bees, which pollinate flowers, and also commercial bees, which are in hives around the world. And this is an ongoing problem. And this case is one that I picked just because of its international flavour, but any of you who've been to the Far East will have eaten durian fruit, or at least seen durian fruit, very, very popular. In fact, the Chinese market for durian fruit is increasing at a very rapid pace. They're expecting a demand of about 4.5 billion kilograms of durian as opposed to 1.6 by 2030, mainly from the Chinese market. And that sounds great for the durian business, but if you actually look at what's happening in Malaysia, for example, there's a massive increase in deforestation. So the rainforest has been taken over now by durian plantations in order to expand durian production. And obviously that's having a bad effect because of habitat loss on various species, one of which is the flying fox. There's a picture of a flying fox. I can't point to it. I normally would point to it, but you can see there's a large bat on the right-hand side at the top. And that is critically endangered. It's becoming critically endangered, which to say, well, you know, does that matter? Well, actually, it's been discovered in the last few years that they're the main pollinators of durian fruit. So by expanding the production of durian fruit, you're reducing the pollinators, which means that you've either got to pollinate them by hand or find ways of encouraging the bats. And also the Malayan tiger, critically endangered. There are less than 200 left in the wild now. And again, you'd say, well, does that matter? Well, obviously the durian plantations are having an impact on that species, as well as lots of other species. And that means that they have an accountability as well. Which brings us to this wonderful concept, which is evolving quite quickly now through the financial markets, of dual materiality, which I think is very, very helpful to progress environmental accounting generally. So if we look at the various motivations for extinction accounting, obviously, as I've said, financial materiality. If you can find a financial materiality for the species, then there has to be accounting around it and there has to be protection. And obviously bees and pollinators are a good example. But where there isn't a financial materiality, there is still an accountability by which companies and other organisations need to report on their impacts on species. So this is where the dual materiality comes in. Companies need to report on the basis of financial materiality or on the basis of accountability for direct impacts. So, for example, the impact of durian production on bats. They also need to consider accountability for indirect impacts. And this is really interesting. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but basically, if you look at the banking industry and the way that their investments and lending has very negative impacts on biodiversity and species, therefore they have an indirect impact, which therefore, again, brings through accountability. And on top of all of those things, you know, there's a moral and ethical accountability to be considered. There's a philanthropic and charitable accountability to be considered. And there's the interdependency and interconnectedness of species. So the fact that all species are interrelated and interdependent means that we don't know for sure whether the disappearance of one species can lead to the collapse of an ecosystem, which means that on a pro rata basis, it's actually important to discharge accountability for impacts on all species. And lastly, religious motivation. You know, many religions around the world consider stewardship for flora and fauna, and that's something that we're exploring in some research at the moment. So in terms of the academic research and the growth of the field of what we call extinction accounting research now, if we go back to the 1990s, and Lynn and I were talking about the 1990s and when we met in the 90s at Grighanog, at that time, the first papers were published in the area of accounting for biodiversity. And biodiversity is defined as the variability among living organisms, basically all life on Earth and all the different species on Earth, and ecosystems, of course. And there's a definition there from the Convention for Biological Diversity. And those are the first three papers really by Mike Jones that looked at developing a framework for companies to report on biodiversity, which is, I think, more of a sort of biodiversity audit. This preceded really any practice by corporations in reporting, which meant that around 10 years ago, we started looking at researching practice because there was an evolution by corporate reporting in the biodiversity area. there was an increasing quantity of reporting of biodiversity information, and that led to a special issue of IIIJ on nature and motivation of biodiversity reporting. The consensus, I would say, of the research in that area around that time was that accounting for biodiversity is dominated by impression management, with a focus on reputational risk management and financial risk and internal control, but very much impression management dominated. And that was discussed in the editorial, which we published in 2013 on problematizing accounting for biodiversity. So that really crystallized, I think, the accounting for biodiversity work. But then we have the evolution of the extinction accounting concept. And what I would say really is that evolved out of the accounting for biodiversity research, but it was the way we identified as researchers that something was changing in corporate reporting on biodiversity. So it was basically extinction accounting as a concept came out of some work that I did with Warren Maroon, Barry and Elisabetta on accounting for rhinos, which was a new departure in the research. And, you know, a lot of people have suggested that, you know, if banks, for example, in South Africa, disclose information on how they're seeking to protect and conserve rhinos, then that seems really strange because they don't have a financial materiality. But of course, as I said, through investments, through lending, they do, of course, fund biodiversity loss effectively. And therefore, there is now an acknowledged in the financial markets, an acknowledged relationship there and an acknowledged impact. What we found by looking at the rhinoceros accounting was that there are motivating factors in the reports which revolve around other things, certainly not financial materiality, but culture, heritage, and even emotional content. So really, really interesting. And the reporting we found had a different type of element to it, which was an emancipatory element. This is just an example. I'm not going to give loads of examples, but you know, this is an example of what we mean by emancipatory extinction accounting for rhinos. This is Investec Bank. That's the company website detail. And it's South Africa, they said, is losing rhinos daily through poaching. Investec has established Investec Rhino Lifeline to respond to the crisis. That means working with trusted partners, biodiversity partners, ecological partners. And we believe that we can make a difference in saving rhino, ensuring its long-term survival. So to us, this was a different type of reporting. This isn't impression management, we felt it was something more than that. And this led basically to a special issue of IIIJ on extinction accounting and accountability. And we sort of define it as a form of emancipatory accounting, which involves the reporting organisation making significant efforts to stem species extinction and enhance biodiversity by reporting regularly in order to demonstrate positive impacts, but also obviously they should be reporting on negative impacts as well, and how that is moving along through time. So the diagram on the right-hand side, which again I can't point to, the pyramid, shows the different stages of extinction accounting according to our frameworks. This is really the original framework. Right at the bottom, we can see a reporting of species which are on the endangered list, the IUCN Red List, whose habitats are affected by the company or the organisation's activities. That's a basic requirement of the GRI principles. But as you go further up, you see that there are other stages to the reporting which demonstrate an emancipatory element. So, you know, reporting actions taken, reporting partnerships with wildlife organisations, reporting assessment on outcomes of these engagements, reporting regular assessments of species populations, and also basically, is it working? What effects are these actions having? And also future strategies. So it's a dynamic framework. Here's a quotation from Sonia Gallhofer and Jim Haslam, which is basically looking at the emancipatory accounting theory and the concepts of emancipatory accounting. They say, you know, a vision of accounting as an emancipatory force is consistent with seeing accounting as a communicative social practice that functions as a system of informing that renders transparent and enlightens with the effect of social betterment. That for me is the core of what we mean by emancipatory accounting. Of course, critical accounting at the moment may not be everybody's flavour of the month, but you know, it is absolutely critical to have critical perspectives on research and on what accounting is. It's not just historic numbers, it's much more than that, and it has social impact. So in terms of being emancipatory, extinction accounting contributes to the prevention of species extinction. And if that's the case, then you have an emancipatory form of accounting and reporting. In terms of the emancipatory nature of extinction accounting, I don't think that element can be overemphasized, because basically reporting without any impact is not worth the paper it's written on. So environmental, ecological and biodiversity reporting that simply underlines the status quo and ensures business as usual is literally a waste of time when we're faced with a massive extinction crisis, which is getting worse all of the time. And as we said in 2018, unless extinction accounting is emancipatory or at least progressive in nature, extinctions will not be prevented. By prioritising an emancipatory extinction accounting, businesses can transform their ethos, their activities and their business strategy to slow and prevent extinctions. I won't go into this in too much detail because I don't want to run out of time, but the new paper, the latest paper that we've published on extinction accounting in China includes a table. This is a summary of the table, which compares the characteristics of an accounting for biodiversity according to the literature with the characteristics of what we see as extinction accounting. I'm not going to read through all of them, but basically you can see that the accounting for biodiversity is very much lacking in any emancipatory potential, imbued with impression management, tends to be more narrative, is motivated primarily by legitimacy, financial materiality, and also reputation, risk management. It tends to be boilerplate and repetitive, whereas an extinction accounting is very different. It's transformative, it's hybrid, quantitative, qualitative, even pictorial disclosures. It goes further than complying with best practice, and it has multi-motivations, as I mentioned before. Mainly it's emancipatory and genders transformational change. Okay, so just looking at the work that's come out in this area, as I say, the B book was the first thing really that we did, where we produced a bee accounting framework, how companies could disclose information on what they were doing to protect bees and pollinators. And the extinction accounting work was published mainly in Around the World's 80 Species, which came out in 2019. And that includes contributions from many academics and practitioners in this area. The first extinction accounting framework was actually published in a book with Professor Mervyn King in 2016, which is Accountants Can Save the Planet. And this work, I think this body of work now is leading to all sorts of interesting developments in the literature. So I've just chosen a few examples, not for any other reason, but I think they show different aspects of the extinction accounting literature. So these two are from the special issue of AAAJ on extinction accounting in 2018. And we've got Ken Weir's paper here, which was, I think, is the first paper on extinction accounting, which looks at the public sector. And he concluded that the practice in the public sector, looking at councils through interview data, was leading to what he calls a subversion of extinction accounting because of the trade-offs between economic and ecological criteria, which I think is a really interesting paper. And also, I think the first quantitative paper in the area of extinction accounting is the paper by Ralph Adler and co. And they looked at the 150 Fortune global companies, and they found an interesting relationship in that quantitative study, essentially, between threatened species reporting and companies that had biodiversity partnerships, which fits in very well with the extinction accounting framework, focusing on partnerships and engagement. There's a few others here. There's one that came out with Lee Roberts, who's doing her PhD in extinction accounting. And that is a literature review where they looked at the literature review in biodiversity accounting and extinction accounting that came out last year. And a recent one as well in 2020, again with Lee Roberts and Abir Hassan, where we looked at impression management and greenwash in reporting. And that's a quantitative study as well. So it's interesting to see how the literature is starting to extend through interview work, through case study work, through frameworks and theoretical development, and through quantitative econometric analysis as well. I think it's really fascinating to see how this area is developing and evolving. There's another paper here by Gunnar Rimmel on birds, conservation of birds, and a really interesting paper that's just been published by some Italian colleagues, by Antonella Cravino and others, looking at extinction accounting in the European tissue industry. So this is particularly interesting from my point of view, because it's really one of the only papers so far looking at flora, rather than fauna. You know, it's actually looking at plants and problems of deforestation and the threats of deforestation to an industry, a different type of industry. Then just recently has come out this paper, which I've actually been working on for 15 years. It's taken me 15 years to get this paper published on Gilbert White. And I think certainly Lynn and others probably on this call will remember me presenting my Nature Diary paper in the past. And amazing actually how much work it's taken to get it published eventually. But it basically looks at extinction accounting 250 years ago, and the records that this guy Gilbert White prepared every day throughout his life, recording species. And what we've done is compare his records with current states of species in the same part of the UK. It's quite a lot more detail in it, but for me, that's a really interesting extension of the extinction accounting research into a historical context. And there's another public sector type study here, which has just come out by Michael Buckling in South Africa, who's doing his PhD on extinction accounting, looking at the South African national parks and how they actually account for their preservation and conservation of species, which again is a fascinating study. There are lots of doctoral students now doing extinction accounting research, which again is really exciting as a development. So one of my students finished his PhD looking at accounting for panda, and that's a picture out of his thesis, and also biodiversity generally, extinction accounting in China. And I have a wonderful student, Mira, I don't know whether she's on the call today, who's looking at extinction accounting for hedgehogs, looking at hedgehogs as the canary in the coal mine for biodiversity collapse. A new student's going to start on orangutan. And I know there are lots of people in Brazil looking at extinction accounting. So very interesting to see how it's evolving and developing. This paper's just come out. This took a lot of time to get accepted, as papers do. And it's examples of emancipatory extinction accounting by Chinese mining companies. Just a couple of examples of the sort of thing we mean by that. Obviously, this has all been translated from Chinese by Longshang. And, you know, this particular company is saying, you know, when we discover protected animals, we report them to the Forestry Bureau. When we discover protected plants, we carry out conservation. So it's really talking about what they do to protect species. And a paper came out yesterday, which I saw on social media. So this is by Alama and a few others, looking at corporate accountability towards species extinction protection. And again, that's a really interesting study. I've not had time to read it all the way through, but you know, it's lovely to see that coming out as well. So in terms of future research pathways, few ideas really coming from the latest developments across the financial markets. So, you know, it seems biodiversity loss and species extinction has suddenly become one of the most important issues across the financial markets. That's been ratified by the World Economic Forum's annual risk report, which shows biodiversity loss is the third most impactful risk facing the global economy. the Dasgupta review, which published in the UK earlier this year, and the latest KPMG survey for the first time highlights biodiversity as a critical area for accounting, you know, their latest report in 2020. And of course, over the top of all of this is the impact of COVID-19, which has really been a catalyst in pushing forward concerns about biodiversity because of interconnectedness and because of the way that COVID was contracted originally. I could talk about that for a long time, but I'm not going to, because I think so want me to stop soon. So, you know, in terms of new research, one of the areas I think that really needs attention is what I would call private extinction accounting or extinction engagement, either term, which is a development of the literature in private reporting, private social environmental reporting, which is really the one-to-one meetings between institutional investors and companies on social environmental issues. There's hardly anything at the moment written about private meetings which are conducted around biodiversity issues. And yet in practice, this is really taking off. And it's over the last 18 months, we've seen fund managers, asset managers globally paying a lot of attention to things like deforestation. And I've mentioned a paper on the right-hand side there, which we've written around some interviews last year during the lockdown, which show that institutional investors are demanding more extinction accounting type information and are engaging much more on these issues. So, you know, this is an example, I won't read through it all, but basically this is an example of an extinction engagement framework, basically the types of questions that institutional investors are asking companies in relation to species decline and extinction. Basically, what are you doing to prevent species decline? Who are you partnering with? You know, what measures are you taking to reduce the impact of your operations? And another really interesting development that you might not have heard about is the release of the Biological Diversity Protocol, which I co-authored with a lot of people. It was developed by the Endangered Wildlife Trust in South Africa, and it's the first proper framework for biodiversity reporting. It incorporates all of the concepts and ideas from extinction accounting research, and it includes a species accounting framework or a taxa accounting framework. Really nice to see people researching the impact and take-up of this new protocol. It's supposed to sit side by side by the Natural Capital Code Protocol and other developments. And, you know, one case study, or I suppose it's a pilot scheme, has been applied by a South African energy company, and that's just been published yesterday on ResearchGate, a really interesting piece of development in practice. And also, you know, the whole area of assurance, if we've got extinction accounting happening in practice increasingly, how's that going to be assured? How is the audit industry going to keep up with these developments? As far as I'm concerned, I don't think anybody yet has actually worked on an extinction assurance model of any sort. And, you know, from an interdisciplinary perspective, it's crucial that auditing firms have input from ecologists and conservationists to be able to actually assure the information that companies are producing. I think this is a really interesting area which people could go into. So I'll finish off now just by showing a few things that are going on. We have an Extinction Accounting Research Network on Facebook, which we set up just over a year ago as some of the founding members. And, you know, every day people are posting things. It's really interesting to keep up with what's going on. If you'd like to join it, search it and become a member. It is a members Facebook site. And also we've started over the last few months an international forum for extinction accounting research, which is a monthly online research seminar series. The next one, you can see advertised at the bottom there, on the 7th of May, is looking at the Middle Eastern perspective on extinction accounting. So everybody's welcome to join in. Everybody's welcome to attend that. And I mentioned to Sarah at the beginning, I'm just finishing a book on implementing a species protection action plan for the financial markets with Martina McPherson, who's at the moment giving the plenary in the corporate governance SIG. on her extinction bond framework, and that's got contributions from institutional investors, from rating agencies, mainly from practitioners, and what they're doing, cutting edge work they're doing in biodiversity. And the last thing is there is a call for papers out, which you're probably aware of, which again is very, very interdisciplinary. It's looking at the historical roots of environmental, ecological accounting, auditing, and accountability. It's co-guest edited with Federica Doni, Karen McBride, Chris Napier, and me. And the deadline, I think, is the end of December this year. So there's still lots of time to do some work in this area. And it's interdisciplinary in the sense that we're looking for contributions and submissions that go across all forms of alternative accounting. So nature diaries, for example, travel journals, letters, reports, reviews, all different types of alternative accounting. And also we're looking at people who are doing research in accounting, alternative accounting for environmental issues, for example, species, in poetry, historic reports, etchings, music, artwork, comparative accounts over time, all of those issues. So, you know, it's a really good place to advertise this call for papers, I think, at the, you know, IPSIG. So I think that's where I'll finish. I don't think I've gone over. I hope I haven't talked too long. And hopefully you've found that interesting. There we are.
Thank you, Jill. That was hugely interesting. Thank you. I've learned a lot myself from listening to you. Thank you. And plenty of details and information there on your slides as well. So thank you. I have a few questions and observations myself, but before I do that, does anybody in the audience want to raise any questions or make any comments? If you do, just raise your hand visually or click the button on Zoom. Yes, Lynn.
I just wanted to actually agree with what you just said, Sarah. That was very, very interesting. It was an excellent presentation, Jill, because you covered a lot of areas, but it was interesting throughout. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, it's very much an evolving area. I mean, very quickly at the moment in accounting, but as I say, also across the finance disciplines. So, I mean, I didn't want to spend a lot of time on it, but the book that we've just finished, I mean, I just have to actually get it to the publishers over the next week. You know, we've got all the cutting edge practice that's going on, for example, in the finance industry, which I think particularly Lynn will be very interested in, you know, the sort of financial instruments that have been developed. We've got a chapter from Vigio Iris on their biodiversity index, which they've created. So a lot of the information providers in the finance industry are developing extremely quickly information sources, rankings, sustainability indexes for biodiversity, because suddenly everybody wants this information. You know, the investors now want to know what companies are doing in this area, and therefore there's a huge lack of data effectively. So, you know, we've got a lot of those sort of showcased in the book. And also on what the investors are doing, I don't know whether you follow the work that Share Action do in the investment industry, and they've produced a couple of reports now where they're looking at the global asset management industry response to the biodiversity crisis, and it's literally, you know, it's just gone up exponentially over the last year or so. And a lot of this has got to do with COVID, because obviously the cause of COVID is quite clearly connected to biodiversity loss. And again, if you look at any of the big investment institutions, their websites at the moment, they've got reports and articles for discussion where they identify these interrelated links and the importance for the financial industry of taking these into account. So it's just a really fascinating area at the moment. And I think it's an area where, you know, in a way, practice has gone far past academic research because of the speed of development in the finance industry, particularly. Just wasn't a bit, I mean, you didn't really ask a question, but that's, you know, I think from a finance point of view, it's just so interesting what's happening at the moment.
What I find interesting, oh, sorry, Lynn, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so the book, you see, it's actually, I'm very keen actually to get a copy of the book, Jill, because I think I'll find it. I'm about to go into my 6 months when I don't work, and I think it'll be a really interesting. You've inspired me to really have a look to see if I can contribute.
I'd love you to. I mean, it'd be lovely to do something. I mean, I think there's a lot of quant studies that can be done around this, really serious, quant studies. I know that there is a lot of quant work going on in the States with like George Surfin, for example, on ESG investment. That's some of the leading work. I mean, obviously I do a lot more of the qualitative work, but, it's just phenomenal to see what is happening. And, of course it's happening for ethical reasons because, the world's falling apart around us. We can't be sure that this is the last pandemic by any means. This is the beginning of these unfortunately apocalyptic type episodes. I mean, a year ago, nobody would have believed what the world is like at the moment. And, the financial markets and the finance people who are so innovative. I mean, I don't want to sound awful, but I do find that the finance people are so much more innovative and so much more quick to pick things up than the accounting bodies in a way. I think that the finance and certainly the investment demand for information is really driving the accounting as well. And the accounting is not moving quickly enough in this area. But, it's starting to. So, it's just really fascinating.
What's the title of the book, Jill?
The title of the book is Extinction Governance, Implementing a Species Protection Action Plan for the Financial Markets. So it has, chapter 2 is basically looking at, I've just finished chapter 1 and 2, which outlines all of the sort of general developments in the financial markets, and it looks at extinction banking, which is again really increasing very quickly. It looks at extinction finance, extinction engagement, and of course extinction accounting. And then we have a whole chapter on extinction governance, basically a corporate governance framework which embeds biodiversity protection into the heart of the governance framework. So, for example, having a non-executive director on the board who actually understands ecological issues, that sort of thing.
When do you think this will be available publicly?
Well, it's finished. I've got to tidy up a few more bits and pieces and get it to Routledge, and who knows, it depends how long the editing process takes. It's got 31 chapters. It's an absolutely massive piece of work with so many contributions from people. I mean, like, for example, the Capitals Coalition, Mark Guff from the Capitals Coalition has written a chapter. They're all leading institutions, and it's just absolutely fascinating to see.
I'll be on the lookout. Or if you just let me know, Joe, if you could drop me an email, that'd be great.
Of course I will do, yeah.
Great. Just leading from something you mentioned earlier, Jill, where you mentioned that the finance people are getting more interested in this kind of information now. And being a critical accounting researcher myself, and I'm very interested in the power relations and the discourse behind this stuff.
Yeah.
I find, what is your take on, my question here is, what's driving this quick growth in extinction accounting? Why are businesses suddenly doing this or practicing this? And is it because, with my accountant's head on now, my critical head on, are they doing this because there'll be maybe a bit of impression management, if I can say it, are they doing this to make sure that they don't lose shareholders so that they look good, because it's all about being green now and being environmentally friendly and etc. Or is there something else driving this?
Well, I think so. I mean, when I was talking about the multiple motivations, there's always an impression management aspect to environmental accounting. But, the whole point of, I think, the way we've developed extinction accounting as a framework, and I suppose a field, is that it's got a lot more to it. So, first of all, you do have financial materiality, which, as I say, is very clear for some species, not so clear for others. I mean, one of the things that we've published on this year is soil health. So, all the insects and all the nasty creepy crawlies, they're critical for soil health, and they're disappearing because of the use of pesticides. Agriculture companies have a financial interest for survival of protecting these things, and they've only just started to realize that. And of course, the other reason, as you point out, is shareholder pressure. So the institutional investors now want to know that the companies they're investing in are actually protecting themselves against biodiversity loss affecting the value chain, against the destruction of value throughout a company's supply chain due to biodiversity loss, etc. And also an accountability imperative, as I say, the development, particularly in Europe, of the dual materiality concept, which is coming through now very strongly, means that there's an imperative to report where you have financial materiality, but also an imperative where there's an accountability due to direct impacts. So, you know, companies are going to have to report if they're having direct negative impacts on species or biodiversity. So there's all these different things coming together. So even, you know, just on the basis of morality and companies having to retain their license to operate, their ability to attract funds. I mean, another driver, I haven't had time to talk about that really, but in the banking industry, there's a pledge which most of the major banks have now signed for protecting biodiversity. So this is becoming a very big issue in the banking industry. They are committing to zero impact on biodiversity, either by trying to have investments in biodiversity, or particularly, and this comes back to the Equator Principles, which I'm sure Lynn will be very interested in, you know, the need to ensure that when they're lending money for capital investments, it's not going to destroy biodiversity. I think it's I can't remember what the figure is, but it's something like 75% or 80% of lending by banks and investments by banks are into industries which are destroying biodiversity. And that's got to change. And that was one of the main conclusions of the Das-Gut review, which came out, you know, earlier this year. There's just a really, really incredible shift in the global financial markets.
Yeah. How would you describe, or if it has, how has the way that companies have reported on extinction accounting or practiced extinction accounting, how has it changed over the years? So is it becoming, you mentioned, I think if I interpreted it correctly, I think you mentioned that it's part of it's becoming more quants. If I understood it rightly, I might have misinterpreted that. Or is there a change, or are they still reporting in the same way, or is it too early to tell?
Well, I think the biodiversity reporting, if you looked at the work that was done around 2010 or whatever, it was very much just impression management work. And I think now, when you're looking at the reporting, it's got a lot more meat to it. So, for example, the Biological Diversity Protocol, which is a fascinating development, that's been implemented by a couple of companies as a pilot in South Africa, as I mentioned. And one of them, which is Eskom, the electric company, is trying to do this detailed biodiversity reporting. And I think the most interesting development for me is the species accounting. So you're actually getting companies following a framework to explain how they're protecting specific species. So, for example, with their reporting, they've got, I think, an area that the company, one particular site that the company is operating on in South Africa, a nature reserve area, and I think they counted 6 of a certain type of bird. And the question in the reporting is, we want to increase the population of these birds. We don't want to see them decrease. And you've basically got a key performance indicator there, which is around one particular species. But then there's this really interesting issue of how many is too many. So actually you wouldn't want more than 10 of these birds, because that would upset the ecosystem. And it's so complex and it's so difficult. This is the biggest challenge for companies now, is working out how to actually protect and enhance these populations without having negative impacts. And, you know, as I say, it means that basically accountants have got to involve ecologists and biodiversity scientists to be able to make these decisions. And of course, it's costly, and the costs may be seen to outweigh the benefits, but ultimately we're facing complete biodiversity collapse, which will lead to, you know, the extinction of human species. So, you know, it's quite an important thing.
And do you find, I mean, say you're a PhD student now who's interested in doing this kind of research, and obviously they can, in terms of data collection now and analysing the data, you know, you have annual reports there and you can use documents as part of your data collection. From your experience, Jill, and from any PhD students that you're supervising, if they approach these corporations, or, you know, if they were lucky enough to interview the CFO or the CEO, you know, are they actually quite willing to participate in this kind of research? Because again, it's part of the, yeah, we're all into it and we want to be shown to be good at this. So
yeah, I think mixed experience, depends on the company. It depends on how far they are along the line to developing these things. So, you know, my one of my students, I can't mention the company specifically, but she's interviewed agrochemical businesses with mixed reception, you know, but they have been prepared to talk to her about it. And, you know, similarly, the interviews that Longzhang did in China, have no problem getting access. I mean, I think what's happening is that businesses are struggling to understand the problem and find ways of dealing with it. So actually, they're very keen to engage with researchers who might be able to, you know, shed some light on what's happening.
Right. I think I've done a lot of talking for the last few minutes. Does anybody else have any questions or comments they'd like to make?
Obviously, if anybody's interested in more research in this area or interested in reading any papers, I can send you a couple of things to read. So, you know, I'm happy for you to send me an email or anything if it's something you'd like to work on. Yes, Lynn.
Yes, Lynn. Lynn, you're on mute.
I was just saying yes, please.
Okay, lovely. Well, it's really, really nice. And we could even meet up, you know, in Wales. You never know, for coffee.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be really
That would
good.
be very exciting. I think I've only seen about 3 people other than, you know, Zoe and my husband face to face for the last year. So, you know.
Yeah, that'd be great, Jill. Yeah.
Let's
do that.
Yeah, we'll have a chat about it. But I think you will be really interested in what's happening in the finance industry, because, you know, it's gone from basically being a very marginal area that I've been working away diligently in for many, many years to being something which has just completely taken off. And the other thing that you might have seen on social media over the last couple of days is that there's now a big push. I don't know where it's coming from because I've not had time to read the article, but business schools are being expected now to adopt and integrate ESG, environmental, social, governance issues, into the heart of their core education. And, you know, biodiversity is very much that. The most interesting development really is that, you know, climate change is now integrated into finance and accounting. And suddenly it's been acknowledged that biodiversity is connected but different, and at least as significant, you know, if not more important than dealing with climate change. So, you know, it's really, really interesting to see what's happening. And of course, incredibly important, because if we don't get it right, you know, this is like the last chance. You know, every species that disappears, that's it, you know, unless you do some sort of Jurassic Park thing, you can't bring it back. Yeah. So it's it's quite scary.
Well done for persevering.
Would you say that a lot of this research has been conducted in Europe, in Asia, and not so much in America, or you're not seeing much of a difference?
I think that, again, things are changing in the US. The Fortune magazine did an interview with me a couple of weeks ago about governance, but basically how social responsibility and ESG are becoming part of governance, and how, you know, we talked about institutional investors and deforestation and engagement or whatever. I think things have changed very quickly in the US recently. I don't know whether it's a result of political change partly, but also, as I say, pressure from the finance industry on companies worldwide now. So, you know, you've had a lot of pressure from institutional investors working collaboratively to pressurize companies in Brazil to stop deforestation. You know, institutional investors taking funds out of oil and gas. All of these issues are becoming very, very important areas of investor activism, particularly. Yeah. Okay. As I say, it's exciting, but it's also horrible at the same time because of, you know, the problems that we're actually facing.
But it's so important though.
It is. It's absolutely critical. I think biodiversity loss is the biggest issue that we've got to face as a global society. I think it's the most important problem.
Yeah.
Climate change, I don't even know if it's reversible. I'm sure, I didn't see Ian's talk, but I'm sure that, you know, climate change can be stemmed to some degree, but I think biodiversity loss is more important. You can help things to cool down, but you can't bring things back from extinction. So
true.
You know.
Absolutely true. Okay, it's nearly 4:30.
And you've got your AGM.
We have our AGM, but I'm more than happy to be flexible and wait a few more minutes if anybody does have any comments or any questions they want to ask before we finish.
I was just wondering if there is any work or research in the context of third sector or cooperatives or, you know, non-for-profit organizations. Is there anything there on extinction accounting or even biodiversity, and how can this type of organizations actually spearhead, you know, the movement and be the ones that give an example of accountability and, you know?
Well, it's interesting that you've asked that, because I was preparing another slide on the third sector, and I decided not to put it in because basically I've got too many slides anyway. And this is something I'm really, really interested in. So I'm on the board of directors for, I think Lynn might have heard of it, and people in Wales, for PAVO, which is the Paris Association of Voluntary Organisations. They have about 2,500. And I did a paper for them on the importance of biodiversity protection, which I think they've shelved onto the sustainability agenda for later in the year. But the thing is, there is in the UK, a national now pressure for the voluntary sector and charities to start taking, you know, environmental issues particularly seriously. So, you know, this is part of the, I think it's the government's green plan or whatever. So this is something which they are going to start having to concern themselves with. I know there's quite a lot going on in the bee area, you know, pollinators and local efforts, councils, etc., to develop pollinator-friendly policies, and I think that's going into the voluntary sector as well. So I think this is an area. I mean, it's the same with governance, corporate governance generally, isn't it? But the public sector follows or trails the private sector, and then, you know, the third sector again comes after. So I think, you know, they need to start focusing attention. It'd be really nice to do some sort of survey or do some interviews with voluntary organisations to see where they're at with these issues. So that's another really important area for research that I don't think anybody's done anything on. You know, councils, public sector, yes, but not voluntary sector and charities.
Okay, well, I think we'll leave it at that then, Jill and everyone. Thank you again, Jill, for a fascinating presentation.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for listening. And I've got my own corporate governance SIG thing that I've got to go to the AGM now, so I'm going to have to.
Right, I didn't realise that.
They're all at the same time.
Right, okay, no problem. Well, thank you again, Jill.
It's okay, lovely to see you. Lovely to see you all, and thanks for asking me. And I hope your AGM goes really well.
Thank you. We hope to see you soon, face to face.
Yes, I really hope so. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.